There is a quiet truth in the Bible that often goes unnoticed. Some of the greatest biblical stories do not begin with visible miracles, but with simple choices made in the midst of pain. The book of Ruth begins this way. No kings, no battles, no famous prophets, just an ordinary woman, foreign, widowed, and seemingly without a future. Even so, the Bible chooses to preserve her story, as if reminding us that God works powerfully through lives the world tends to overlook. Ruth does not enter the narrative with grand promises, but with faithfulness. She has no guarantees, only convictions. In a setting marked by loss and uncertainty, the biblical story shows that her decision to remain changes everything. To remain with Naomi, to remain in humble work, to remain faithful to the God of Israel. The Bible reveals that God is not looking for perfect people, but for hearts willing to continue, even when the path seems dark. Perhaps this is why the story of Ruth connects so deeply with our reality. Who has not felt invisible, forgotten, or simply trying to survive? The biblical story shows that God sees what no one else sees. He transforms ordinary fields into places of encounter, simple work into preparation, and daily faithfulness into eternal purpose. What seems small today may be the beginning of something far greater tomorrow. In this content, we will dive deeply into the book of Ruth and uncover lessons about faithfulness, character, work, courage, redemption, and divine purpose. These are not shallow lessons, but truths that cross generations and remain profoundly relevant today. The Bible does not record the biblical story of Ruth by accident. It is filled with meaning for those who desire to live a life of communion with God. So if you want to learn from the biblical story, grow spiritually, and strengthen your walk with God through the Bible, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any content and can continue deepening your faith. Because the story of Ruth is not only about the past, it still has much to teach those who are willing to listen. The biblical story of Ruth begins in a setting of loss, displacement, and difficult choices, those moments no one wants to face, yet that reveal who we truly are. The Bible does not soften the context. Famine, death, grief, and uncertainty walk side by side. In the midst of this silent chaos, a decision emerges that changes everything, not through noise or spectacle, but through inner firmness. It is at this point that Ruth steps into the scene, showing that true character is revealed when circumstances tighten. And it is precisely here that loyalty stops being theory and becomes practice. The first lesson we learn from Ruth is that true faithfulness does not depend on convenience, but on conviction. When Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem, she offers no promises, no stability, no security, only a difficult road ahead. Even so, Ruth chooses to remain. The Bible records this decision as a turning point because it was not made in a moment of emotion, but in the clarity of commitment. The biblical story makes it clear that faithfulness is not a reaction. It is a conscious choice. This faithfulness shows itself in words, but it is born much earlier in the heart. Ruth does not merely follow Naomi geographically. She chooses to share her destiny, her identity, and her future. By saying she would go wherever Naomi went, she was closing entire chapters of her own life. The Bible shows that this kind of loyalty demands real sacrifice, not symbolic gestures. There is no room for halfway commitments when it comes to genuine devotion. In everyday life, this lesson challenges the culture of quick abandonment, where relationships are maintained only as long as they remain comfortable. The biblical story of Ruth teaches that loyalty is not staying while everything makes sense, but remaining even when there are no visible guarantees. The Bible values those who uphold decisions in the dark, trusting that the path will be revealed step by step. Here, faithfulness is not emotion, it is posture. The second lesson we learn from Ruth is that true commitment goes beyond cultural, social, and religious barriers. By declaring that Naomi's God would be her God, Ruth breaks completely with everything that once defined her. The Bible emphasizes this moment because it is not merely a geographic change, but a transformation of identity. The biblical story shows that authentic faith involves leaving old frameworks behind in order to embrace a new direction. Ruth was a Moabite, a foreigner, part of a people despised by Israel. Even so, the Bible does not present her origin as an obstacle, but as a contrast that highlights the greatness of her decision. Her commitment to the God of Israel reveals that God does not look at lineage, but at the intention of the heart. The biblical story reinforces that spiritual belonging is not born from blood, but from a sincere choice to follow. This kind of commitment requires courage because it means leaving behind belief systems, habits, and comfort zones. The Bible presents Ruth as someone who did not try to adapt God to her former life, but instead adapted her life to the God she chose to serve. It is a deep, silent, and transformative movement. The biblical story shows that true change begins within, before it ever becomes visible on the outside. When Ruth invokes the name of the Lord in her declaration, she seals an irreversible commitment. There are no exit clauses, no alternative plans. The Bible records this to show that mature faith does not negotiate principles when circumstances become difficult. The biblical story reveals that deep spiritual decisions shape entire destinies, even when they seem small at the moment they are made. And it is precisely from this double-choice, unshakable loyalty and genuine spiritual commitment that Ruth's journey moves forward into a new season. The Bible begins to shift the narrative from internal decisions to practical action. The biblical story does not reveal everything yet, but it leaves clear hints that those who remain faithful in the unseen will be led into experiences that completely transform their future. The biblical story of Ruth moves forward and shifts its setting, yet it does not lose depth. Now, the Bible takes us from the realm of internal decisions to the literal field of daily labor. Bethlehem appears as a place of new beginnings, but also of scarcity and effort. Ruth arrives as a foreigner, a widow, and poor, with no privileges or guarantees. It is within this simple and demanding environment that her character begins to reveal itself even more clearly. The third lesson we learn from Ruth is that there is dignity in humble work when it is done with purpose. Instead of waiting for someone else to solve her situation, she takes the initiative to glean the most basic task allowed by the law. The Bible makes a point of recording that she worked from early morning with consistency and dedication. The biblical story shows that it is not the type of work that defines a person's value, but the posture with which it is carried out. Ruth does not present herself as a victim of circumstances, nor does she use her pain as an excuse for inaction. She acts within the possibilities she has, even if they are limited. The biblical reveals that this kind of attitude honors God because it demonstrates responsibility and humility. The biblical story teaches that noble character is formed in daily life, especially when no one is watching. The barley field becomes, in that moment, a place of spiritual formation. This lesson challenges the idea that only visible or socially valued work matters. The Bible shows that God observes faithfulness in what is simple, repetitive, and tiring. Ruth does not despise the process, nor does she complain about the position she occupies at that moment. The biblical story makes it clear that those who are faithful in little are being prepared, often without realizing it, for greater responsibilities. Humble work becomes fertile ground for divine action. The fourth lesson we learn from Ruth is that divine providence operates in details that appear casual. The Bible states that she happened to glean in the field of Boaz. The biblical story uses this language to provoke reflection, not to suggest luck, but to reveal God's sovereignty. What seems random to human eyes is often precise direction in divine hands. Ruth did not know who Boaz was, nor that that field carried a direct connection to her future. Even so, the Bible shows that God was already arranging the scene before she understood the plot. The biblical story teaches that providence does not cancel human effort, but works alongside it. Ruth went to work, and God took care of aligning the circumstances. This lesson broadens our view of daily life. The Bible reveals that God does not act only through obvious miracles, but also through encounters, simple choices, and routine decisions. The biblical story of Ruth shows that daily faithfulness creates strategic opportunities. What begins as necessity ends up becoming a connection to a greater purpose. Nothing is wasted when there is obedience. When Ruth steps into that field, she is only seeking provision, but God is already writing her future. The Bible highlights this to teach that providence is not instant magic. It is a silent construction. The biblical story reveals that God positions the right people in the right places at the right time. Often, divine direction manifests while someone is simply doing what needs to be done. And it is precisely at this point that the narrative begins to take on new contours. Ruth's humble work and God's quiet providence create the perfect environment for encounters that will change the course of the story. The Bible begins to introduce characters and decisions that reveal deep values such as generosity and character. The biblical story has not yet reached its peak, but it makes clear that something greater is about to unfold. As the biblical story of Ruth unfolds, the Bible begins to highlight not only her actions, but also the character of those who cross her path. The setting remains simple. The field is still the same, yet relationships now emerge that reveal deep values. At this point, the narrative makes it clear that God is not only shaping faithful individuals, but also connecting people of character. The biblical story shows that the right encounters happen when shared principles recognize one another. The fifth lesson we learn from Ruth is that true generosity goes beyond minimum obligation. Boaz could have done only what the law required, allowing her to glean without being mistreated. However, the Bible records that he did far more than necessary. The biblical story highlights this attitude to show that genuine generosity is not limited to duty, but flows from a heart sensitive to the needs of others. Boaz does not treat Ruth as a social burden to be tolerated, but as someone worthy of honor and care. He ensures her protection, provides food, and creates a safe environment where she can work with dignity. The Bible intentionally details these actions because small gestures reveal great values. The biblical story teaches that generosity is not merely about giving things, but about offering respect, safety, and welcome. This lesson challenges the mindset of doing just enough to avoid failure. The Bible shows that Boaz does not ask, "What is the minimum required?" but acts with abundance. The biblical story reveals that people of character do not calculate kindness, they practice it. The generosity presented here does not seek recognition, but expresses inner integrity. It is the natural reflection of someone who understands responsibility as a privilege. The sixth lesson we learn from Ruth is that genuine virtue is recognized even without self-promotion. The Bible makes it clear that Boaz already knew who Ruth was before speaking directly with her. Her reputation had been built through consistent actions, not speeches. The biblical story teaches that true character creates a voice that speaks for itself, even when the person remains silent. Ruth is called a virtuous woman, not because of appearance, origin, or status, but because of her daily choices. The Bible shows that her loyalty to Naomi, her dedication to work, and her respectful posture shaped that reputation. The biblical story reinforces that virtue is not something claimed, it is something perceived. Wise people know how to recognize this kind of character. This lesson teaches that true recognition is not born from a rush for validation, but from consistency in doing good. The Bible presents a clear contrast between fame and honor. The biblical story shows that honor is built slowly, like someone planting without haste, trusting the right timing. Ruth's virtue did not need to be announced. It was noticed. Furthermore, Boaz's response reveals the importance of valuing goodness when it is recognized. The Bible shows that he not only acknowledges virtue, but affirms and protects it. The biblical story teaches that recognizing another person's character is also an act of justice. Healthy environments are built when virtues are honored and encouraged. And it is precisely at this point that the narrative begins to deepen even further. Boaz's generosity and Ruth's virtue create a solid foundation for future decisions that will require courage and discernment. The Bible begins to guide the biblical story toward moments of choice that involve risk and hope. What until now has been character expressed in silence will soon require boldness in action. The biblical story of Ruth now enters a more sensitive territory, where decisions require not only character, but well-directed courage. The Bible changes the rhythm of the narrative and leads the reader into a moment of quiet tension where every gesture carries meaning. It is no longer just about working and waiting, but about acting with discernment. It is in this setting that Ruth's spiritual maturity is revealed even more deeply. The seventh lesson we learn from Ruth is that there is a wise courage that knows when to act without breaking principles. Guided by Naomi, she approaches Boaz respectfully within the customs of the time, even knowing she could be misunderstood. The Bible records this episode to show that boldness is not recklessness, but a willingness to take difficult steps with purity of intention. The biblical story teaches that mature faith knows how to distinguish necessary risk from rashness. Ruth does not act driven by emotional impulse or desperation. She follows instruction, observes the context, and positions herself with humility. The Bible makes it clear that her posture was dignified, quiet, and respectful. The biblical story reveals that true courage does not need noise to be effective. Sometimes, the boldest act is simply to present oneself with truth and confidence. This lesson challenges the idea that waiting on God means absolute passivity. The Bible shows that there are moments when faith is expressed through appropriate initiative. Ruth teaches that acting is not taking control, but cooperating with the timing and paths that God establishes. The biblical story points out that opportunities often require response, not just expectation. The eighth lesson we learn from Ruth is that integrity respects processes, even when the desired outcome seems close. Boaz could have immediately assumed the role of redeemer, but he chooses to honor the existing legal order. The Bible emphasizes this decision to show that character does not bend to convenience. The biblical story teaches that doing what is right includes respecting priorities and rights, even when no one is forcing compliance. Boaz acts with transparency, bringing the matter before the elders of the city and handling everything publicly. The Bible highlights this detail because true integrity does not fear exposure. The biblical story reveals that proper processes protect people, relationships, and purposes. Rushing could have compromised everything, but righteousness preserves the future. This lesson shows that not every fast path is the right one. The Bible presents a clear contrast between legitimate desire and premature action. The biblical story teaches that spiritual maturity knows how to wait for the right time, even when the solution seems within reach. Integrity is not delay, it is protection. By respecting the process, Boaz demonstrates that redemption cannot be born from injustice. The Bible shows that the end never justifies wrongful means. The biblical story reinforces that God honors those who choose the right path, even when it requires patience. Obedience to principles sustains the blessing that is to come. And it is precisely after this combination of balanced courage and firm integrity that the narrative approaches its climax. The biblical story begins to reveal that the long-awaited redemption is about to fully manifest. The Bible prepares the ground for complete restoration, where decisions made in silence will result in visible transformation. What was built with faithfulness, work, generosity, and character now moves toward fulfillment. The biblical story of Ruth reaches its highest point, where everything that was lived in silence begins to make sense. The Bible leads the narrative into a moment of complete restoration, showing that no act of faithfulness was wasted. What was once loss is transformed into hope. What was emptiness is now filled with meaning. The biblical story reveals that God does not work merely to solve immediate problems, but to rebuild entire futures. The ninth lesson we learn from Ruth is that true redemption restores dignity and future. When Boaz publicly assumes the role of Redeemer, he does not merely resolve a legal matter, but returns honor to those who had been marginalized. The Bible shows that Ruth is no longer seen as a vulnerable foreigner, but now occupies a place of respect. The biblical story teaches that redemption is not only deliverance, it is repositioning. Naomi is also reached by this redemption. The one who had returned, embittered, now holds in her arms a clear sign of renewal. The Bible highlights that the restoration was not only material, but emotional and spiritual. The biblical story shows that God cares both for the present and for wounded memories of the past. Redemption here means complete healing. This lesson expands the biblical understanding of restoration. The Bible reveals that God does not redeem people merely to leave them surviving, but so that they may truly live with hope. The biblical story of Ruth shows that divine redemption restores identity, security, and perspective. Where there was once shame, there is now publicly recognized honor. The 10th lesson we learn from Ruth is that God fulfills eternal purposes through ordinary individual stories. The Bible closes the book with a genealogy that connects Ruth to King David. The biblical story does this to show that simple choices, made with faithfulness, echo through generations. Ruth did not live to make history, yet she became part of it. The most striking detail is that the Bible, in the New Testament, includes Ruth in the genealogy of Jesus. The biblical story reveals that a foreign, widowed, and poor woman became part of the plan of redemption for humanity. This reinforces that God does not limit his purposes to the immediate context of a single life. What seems small may be connected to the eternal. This lesson challenges the idea that only extraordinary lives produce eternal impact. The Bible shows that God works through daily faithfulness, not visibility. The biblical story of Ruth teaches that divine purpose does not require fame, but consistent obedience. Every faithful decision becomes a link in a much larger story. Ruth never knew she would become part of the Messiah's lineage. Still, the Bible shows that God was guiding everything with precision. The biblical story reveals that divine purpose is fulfilled even when it is not perceived. This teaches that living faithfully today is trusting that God is already caring for tomorrow. As this journey comes to a close, the Bible does not highlight personal achievements, but continuity of purpose. The biblical story ends by pointing to something greater than Ruth, greater than Boaz, greater than Naomi. God's plan moves forward, woven together by simple, silent, and faithful decisions. And that is precisely what transforms an ordinary life into part of an eternal story. As we look at the entire biblical story of Ruth, the Bible invites us to pause honestly and look inward. This is not just an ancient narrative. It is a spiritual mirror. Ruth shows us that a life aligned with God is not built through grand speeches, but through small, consistent, and faithful decisions. Faithfulness when no one is watching, work when no one is applauding, character when it would be easier to give up. It is on this simple ground that God builds extraordinary stories. The book of Ruth reveals that communion with God is not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. She experiences loss, uncertainty, and new beginnings, yet she never walks alone. The Bible makes it clear that when the heart turns toward God, even the most unlikely fields become places of encounter. God does not wait for a perfect life. He waits for a willing heart. And Ruth proves that when someone chooses to remain with God, God remains guiding every step. This biblical story also calls us to reorder our priorities. In a fast-paced world, Ruth teaches us to slow down in order to obey, to trust the process, and to honor principles. Turning the heart back to God means choosing a life of deeper communion, greater spiritual sensitivity, and less need for control. It is allowing God to write the story, even when we do not understand the next chapter. The Bible assures us that no faithfulness lived in secret is ever wasted. Now, the reflection is yours. Which lesson from Ruth touches your heart the most? Unshakable faithfulness, humble work, balanced courage, generosity, or redemption that transforms destinies? Write in the comments which lesson inspires or impresses you the most. Your response may encourage others who are walking the same path. And if this content has strengthened your life, if this biblical story has spoken to you in any way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you can continue learning, growing, and deepening your communion with God through the Bible. May the story of Ruth not be just something you heard, but something that transforms the way you live.